Thanks too much. And today we're going to be talking about Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is one of those very special games that is not only trying to do something different, but is also trying to say something. Just as a fair warning, I will be spoiling pretty much the entire game because this analysis requires it in order for me to get into detail about specifics and how important I think this game is. If you haven't played it already, please do so because it is one of those games that truly needs to be experienced. With that said, fair warning is fair warning. Let's get into it. Mixing real life struggles, history, and popular mythology is a balancing act that requires a lot of care and attention. If you do it right, you can create an experience that is both powerful and stays with you long after the journey is over. If you do it wrong, then you run the danger of being accused of not taking the themes you are supposed to respect seriously and just adding popular mythology to make your product more marketable. Not to mention that you need to make sure you respect the history in which the mythological stories come from. This was the huge task that Ninja Theory, the developers of Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, had to face going into this project. Hellblade was touted as a AAA indie game, meaning that while the production values were high, the entire team working on the game would be no more than 20 people, and a budget no more than $20 million, a small amount in today's gaming industry. Uber franchises such as Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed are everywhere nowadays, so it's refreshing to see a game that's not only trying something different, but is also trying to say something. Hellblade is as much about Norse mythology as it is about real-life Vikings, their invasion of the Orkney Islands in a present-day Scotland, and the Pick warrior Senua in the middle of this invasion as she manages her psychosis while going through the painful and destructive emotions of abuse, loss, and grief. This is a hell of a lot to throw at one game, but in Hellblade, the mythology, history, and emotions are complicated and powerful beyond anything I've experienced in a game for quite some time. Not since the first season of Telltale's Walking Dead series was I driven to tears by the ending of a game. Hellblade is a prime example of how video games can mix subjects that really shouldn't go together and make them work flawlessly. All this with a small team and small budget makes the fact that Ninja Theory actually pulled this off even more remarkable. But before I continue, I want to clarify a few things to avoid any confusion. I will be using the words Norse and Viking interchangeably, as well as using the words Celtic and Pict interchangeably. I know there are differences in the meaning to these words, but for the purpose of this analysis, both word groups work fine in helping me not confuse my points while still demonstrating the complexities Hellblade presents to the player. The Norse mythology, as well as Viking and Celtic history in Hellblade, is rich and well researched, but even that is just a backdrop for the theme the game really wants to tackle: psychosis. Your player character, Senua, is a Celtic warrior on a mission to save the soul of her slain lover, Dillion, by bargaining with Hela, the half-dead Viking goddess, to release him since in Norse mythology, she is the guardian of the underworld. During my first playthrough of Hellblade, I had little to no knowledge of Norse mythology and even less about Viking and Celtic culture. But the well-researched images of Norse mythology give this game a unique feel. And since this is also a game about the struggles of psychosis, you can't always trust what Senua sees, even though a lot of environmental storytelling is done through her visions that serve as story bits of important events in her life. As the game progresses, you learn about Senua, her life, and her struggle with mental illness during the 8th century, a time when mental illness of any kind was not understood at all. Hell, even today, the topics of mental illness and mental health are considered somewhat taboo. Senua was born to a mystic mother, who was one of the few people in her life that show her any love and even encouraged her to embrace the way she views the world. But she was also born to an abusive religious father who saw Senua's mental illness as a curse, which Senua herself refers to as, quote-unquote, the darkness. Because of this, Senua grows up alone and blaming herself for any negative experiences she has in her life, barely going outside of her village except to run menial errands and always under the watchful eye of her father, who himself is a sort of Celtic priest and believes that his daughter's darkness can only be cured through the Celtic gods. Not surprisingly, this makes Senua truly believe that her psychosis is a curse, a real darkness, which will hurt anyone she loves unless she keeps to herself and follows her father's ways. For a while, her mother was her only means of support and understanding, but her own father burned her at the stake when Senua was just a child because he believed her mother suffered from the same illogical curse or darkness. This tragic experience worsened Senua's psychosis, making her an even more isolated person, with voices in her head she calls furies that regurgitate any emotion she is feeling back at her, even when those emotions contradict each other. It's not until Senua grows up and falls in love that she decides to stand up to her father and leaves to be with her lover in his village. That is, until a plague kills many of the people in her new village. Senua, believing her curse caused the plague, blames herself, and even though Dillion begs her to stay, Senua self-exiles herself until she can somehow cure her curse. She goes out into the wilds as something that was actually done in Celtic society in real life as a form of penance, meeting a mystic named Druth who is well versed in Norse mythology. Druth is just as unhinged as Senua, maybe even more so, but because of this, Druth understands her. Druth isn't afraid of her, and Senua listens to his tales of Norse mythology, which are somewhat corrupted by the experiences he had because of the torture he went through in his own past due to being a Viking slave. After a year, Druth dies, and Senua returns to Dillion's village only to find it destroyed and pillaged by the Vikings during her absence. Dillion himself is sacrificed as a blood eagle, a brutal form of torture strongly believed to be done in real life by Vikings as an offering to their gods. Having lost everything, and being guided by the mythological stories told to her by Druth, Senua takes Dillion's head and begins her journey to Helheim to save his soul. It's here where Senua's journey begins in earnest, at the outskirts of Helheim, on an impossible adventure to save someone who is already dead. One of the genius things about the start of the game is that you don't really know whether Senua's journey is real or if it's all in her head. As the game goes on, it becomes clear that everything you're doing is either a psychosis illusion or a manifestation of Senua's emotions, or both. And even the most common encounters in the game have meaning if you care to look beyond the surface. Reviews for this game praise the story and the care that went into representing psychosis in a respectful way, but pointed out that the gameplay mechanics were very simple, mainly in the combat. It's true that the actual gameplay is not as deep as in other games, but Hellblade is a game that wants you to experience it first, play it second. The most common enemies are Vikings, but they look scary. Real-life Vikings are scary enough, but the Vikings Senua faces feel like they're 9 feet tall and talk in this inaudible, demonic mumble and growl every time they attack. It might seem exaggerated at first, but this is how Senua sees Vikings. Senua has never seen one in real life, so when she made it back to her village, the death and destruction she witnessed, along with the descriptions given to her by Druth, make her see the Vikings as these evil, devilish beings that wear animal skulls and are sometimes literally gigantic, disfigured monsters. Senua has no reference to how a Viking looks like. Remember, this is the 8th century, so to her, Vikings might as well be these monsters that destroyed her home and killed her lover. With this context presented, the combat becomes a lot more meaningful. Yes, mechanically the combat is simple, but the meaning is deeply personal to Senua. She wanted to be there when the Vikings raided her village. She wanted to fight and even die alongside Dillion if necessary. But she wasn't there, and she believes that the destruction of her village is her fault when, in fact, it isn't. This feeling of enormous guilt along with grief due to the loss of a loved one is why Senua is primarily fighting herself. Everything that the player does is a battle happening in Senua's head, and every emotion has a Nordic manifestation. Even the calmer moments are composed by sounds of thunder in the distance. The boss fights are also symbolic to Senua, and the gods as well as creatures from Norse mythology are smartly used to represent struggles Senua goes through. Before Senua can face Hela, she needs to defeat two gatekeepers to enter her realm, Soot and Valravn. Both of these entities have a base in real-life Viking mythology, but to Senua they represent something much more personal. The fire god Soot is a manifestation of the fire and destruction that destroyed the village where she lived with Dillion due to the Viking invasion, and Valravn, a creature of illusion, represents the uncertainty and doubts Senua feels in a world where she can't even trust what she sees. All of these confrontations are difficult and they leave Senua scarred, but she needs to go through these battles within herself if she expects to move on. Anyone who has been through loss and grief will describe how painful and destructive these emotions can be, but they will also describe how powerful they are. I can only speak for myself, but when I have gone through the loss of a loved one or even heartbreak, my emotions of pain were to be expected. What I didn't expect, at least back when I went through these feelings the first time through, is how powerful these emotions can be. I remember telling people close to me that if someone literally caved my chest and ripped my heart out, I would barely flinch because the emotions of pain I was going through were so powerful that any actual physical pain seemed minuscule by comparison. One of the best depictions I've read of how powerful the feelings of loss and grief can be is in the graphic novel The Crow by James O'Barr. In it, the main protagonist called Eric Draven is awakened from the dead by the powers of the titular Crow, a year after he and his soon-to-be wife are brutally murdered. Eric Draven's emotions of loss and heartbreak are made manifest in the novel by the fact that he is completely invincible and uses this power to hunt down the men responsible for the death of his fiancée. The author himself admitted that he wrote this story when his own fiancée was tragically killed in a car crash as a productive way to deal with the emotions he was going through. Now, I am not saying that these types of emotions are superpowers for people who are forced to go through them. But what I am saying is that everyone and anyone will come out stronger once these emotions have run their course. Giving these feelings some sort of manifestation, some sort of image, whether in books or video games, can make others understand what a person suffering from loss is going through, even if, at the end of the day, we all need to fight our own battles, just like Senua. Another idea that is either brilliant or deceitful depending on who you ask is the illusion of permadeath. Early in the game, Senua gets some sort of black growth in her arm that's referred to as the rot. The idea is that every time you die, the rot will grow, and if the rot reaches Senua's head, then she will die permanently, and you will have to start the game all over. But it's actually a bluff, and it's not until the end of the game that you realize what the rot truly means. Symbolically, some people have appreciated the bluff of permadeath in Hellblade as a representation of their own anxieties over something that really isn't a big deal, and I can relate to that. If you die in the game, you can always try again. Even in a game like Dark Souls, you can always try again. Nothing is stopping you from completing any game, and even if permadeath was real, you can always try again. There are moments in the game where you are completely overwhelmed by the vast number of enemies, and I'm almost certain that in these situations, that's how the game wanted me to feel. I would be surrounded from all sides, and even when using the time-slowing ability called Focus, defeat was all but certain, and you would see the rot growing in Senua's arm. But unless you have the game set on hard, you'll be given extra breathing room the next time you try, similar to how real-life struggles tend to get easier the more you try. It doesn't always happen this way, but more often than not, it does. The block is a mental one, and I can recall various parts in my life where I have been anxious about something, only to stop, think about it thoroughly, and realize whatever I was anxious about was not such a big deal. However, those who criticize the permadeath bluff point out, very validly, that this idea just puts more stress on a game that is already dealing with heavy themes as it is. We are dealing with psychosis, grief, and loss, and adding a permadeath mechanic as a bluff can seem to be a little insensitive to some people who will take this game as seriously as it should. To me, both sides of the permadeath argument are right, and I don't think this is a cop-out answer, but an admission that, with some issues such as this one, contrasting points of view won't reach a right or wrong stance, but rather just a middle ground in which the issue is too complex to be giving only one solid answer. But the rot is not the only thing driving Senua's journey. Senua's memories and voices in her head are given prominence as well. As mentioned before, the voices in Senua's head are referred to as Furies, and they serve as a great representation for someone like myself to understand what a person going through psychosis or other mental illness might experience when a therapist or counselor asks the question, "Are you hearing voices?" It's important to note that the development team did extensive research on psychosis, both by talking to medical experts and by listening to the experiences of real-life people that were both brave enough and willing enough to talk about what they go through to make Hellblade as respectable to these issues as possible. Some strong criticism was lodged at the game for simplifying the experience of someone living with psychosis, and that we needed to know more about Senua before her break from reality. However, this is between a 6 to 8 hour game at best, and even though those 6 to 8 hours are packed with story, some simplification has to happen when you are talking about emotions and health issues that can last a lifetime. Real life people were used as inspiration for Senua's story, and her story is not a definitive experience for those that go through psychosis or any other mental health struggle. Her experience is one of many, and the mythology and history added serves to create a story filled with pain, meaning, and revelation. It's not a game that will sugarcoat its narrative. The first time Senua faces Hela, she is quickly defeated because, as we find out later, she isn't ready to accept the facts about her life just yet, even when she knows them to be true and does genuinely want to move on. One of the most memorable parts of the game comes right after Senua's sword is destroyed and she needs to pass 4 trials to retrieve Grammar, a sword capable of killing a god. The thing is, these trials are all memories and emotions that Senua has been suppressing, but is now facing them head on. One shows what happened when she finally stood up to her father and left his village, and another shows the guilt she felt when the plague killed many in her new village, as she thought her curse was the cause of all the destruction. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are moments of beauty as well, particularly the memory Senua has when meeting Dillion for the first time. The landscape is lush with foliage, the sun is shining bright, and the first conversation Senua had with Dillion is awkwardly heartwarming. The encounter is purposely rosy because this is how Senua remembers it. Her psychosis might elevate her pain, but it also elevates her happiness, and though few and far between, the moments the player experiences these happy moments with Senua do stick for a long time because of the juxtaposition of how painful everything else can be. Senua can't fast forward her grief, and as she becomes more depressed, the Furies regurgitate these feelings back at her, but you can't stay that way forever. Eventually, even with all the pain you are feeling, you move forward and realize that the pain can't hold you down, even if it does slow you down. After every defeat, there is still a part of Senua that encourages her to move forward, even though she really wants to give up. After every defeat, Senua needs time to herself, even if that time is used for self-loathing. But eventually, you start to see things a little clearer. You start to tackle the emotions head on, and you try again to the point that the Furies in Senua's head start to encourage rather than put her down. As the game goes on, the Furies fluctuate between empowerment and disempowerment, but the reality is that these are Senua's feelings about her own situation, and many times the Furies don't really talk up or down to Senua, but rather express her emotions, and those emotions do include self-loathing much of the time. If Senua is scared, the Furies talk so fast to the point of being inaudible. If Senua is doing well in certain battles, the Furies even trash talk for her. The Furies are a link to Senua's emotions, and by the end of the game, they are the part of her that she must leave behind so that she can finally move forward. When Senua finishes the 4 trials, she is rewarded with the sword Grammar. With her new weapon intact, she sets off to kill Hela, so that she can finally bring back Dillion. Her return journey to Hela's lair is filled with even more setbacks and torturous memories of the loss of her mother and the loss of her village. But eventually, Senua opens the gates that lead her to Hela. But before Senua can enter, she comes across a mirror. She sees a reflection of herself, and this reflection begs her to stay, not to cross over to the other side. Her reflection is very pale, almost photo negative. "Stay with me," she says. "Don't leave. Let's go back." To which Senua responds, "There is nothing to go back to." Finally, at long last, Senua is ready to face Hela and leaves her doubts, insecurities, and guilt behind. It all culminates in a final battle that is extremely cathartic after all the pain and hardship it took to get Senua to this point. When you enter Hela's lair, she's gigantic, but she doesn't attack you head on. Instead, she sends wave after wave of Viking enemies, and even the boss characters make an appearance to stop Senua from reaching Hela. There are two very important and powerful things that happen to Senua as she fights her way to Hela. One is that she can't die. She can still be hurt and knocked down by the overwhelming number of enemies the game throws at you, but Senua will always get back up and continue fighting, at least until she reaches Hela. Senua is done running from her emotions and her past. She will face her biggest guilt head on, and there is nothing that will stop her from mustering up the courage to finally move on. The second thing is that the Furies no longer tuck down to Senua. It's a small detail, but for anyone who played the game, they will remember that the Furies would, more often than not, talk down to Senua and tell her to give up because that's how she was always feeling. "You're worthless. You're weak. Give up. You can't make it." But now, those Furies are gone, and they only speak to aid Senua in her final battle. No more self-doubt, no more self-loathing, just determination to finally move forward. By the time Senua reaches Hela, she is battered, bruised, and bloodied, but refuses to go down. At this point, Senua is exhausted, and you are put in an impossible situation where you can fight as long as you want, but eventually you will be defeated by Hela's army. As Senua lies on the floor, Hela stands above her with a look of frustration and pity. Even as Senua crawls to protect the last piece she has of Dillion, Senua mocks and chastises Hela, telling her that she will not believe her lies anymore. "You're not a lie, but you're a liar," Senua says as she rocks back and forth with Dillion's head in her arms. It's here where I realized what Hela truly is. Just like everything in the game, she's a manifestation. Every emotion that caused Senua pain, grief, and suffering is standing right in front of her. She eventually begins to bargain with Hela. Senua will be her slave if she releases Dillion, even assist her at Ragnarok, the end of times in real-life Norse mythology. But if Hela won't give her Dillion, then she dares Hela to kill her, because, as Senua puts it, "I have nothing else to give. No more pain, no more hate, nothing." Hela then grabs her by the throat and impales her with her own sword. As Senua lays dying, she has one more memory of Dillion, telling her that she can't erase pain because without it there would be no joy. Hela then picks up Dillion's head and she's seen crying. Hela walks to the edge of a cliff and lets Dillion's head fall. When the camera returns to where Hela stood, there you see Senua saying goodbye to Dillion. Finally, after all the pain, after all the hardship, after all the suffering, Senua was able to let go. The rot that was growing in Senua's arm is gone. The Furies even acknowledge that while the scars of loss will always be there, the pain of those scars has fully run its course. At the beginning of the game, Senua had a vision that this journey would end in her death. And indeed, Senua did die. The Senua that could not let go, no matter how hard she tried, and the Senua that imposed so many self-destructive emotions on herself, did die. But now, Senua can move forward. She can leave Helheim. She can return to reality and pick up her life where she had left it. Some people believe that this ending can be sad because even if Senua can return to reality, she's still alone. But Senua is nothing if not a warrior, both in her mind and in real life. Senua has been alone before and survived. And as the game comes to a close, Senua looks at the camera, at the player, and says, "There is more to our adventure. Come with us." And there is indeed more to our adventure, both metaphorically and literally. The metaphorical adventure is life, and life will continue for both Senua and ourselves even after tragedy sets us off course. And the adventure will literally continue because it was recently announced that a sequel to Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is in the works. So we will not have to wait long to see where Senua goes after she conquered her own demons. But regardless of where Senua's story goes from here, this game is a reminder that no matter how sad you are, no matter how defeated you feel, no matter how much loathing you impose on yourself, you can always rise up. These feelings do not last forever, and regardless of what you need to do to get out of Helheim, the world will take you back when you are ready to go back to it. Thank you for watching.
This is where my story once began. And so it has to end here. Because I cannot see further than this.
Follow us. We have another story to tell.
My friend. Go with her. This now will be your story